Welcome to 'Cause We're Nerds, the podcast that covers trends and new releases, from comics to movies, video games, board games, and much more. I'm your host, Zach, and with me is my co-host and cousin, Caleb.
Hey everyone.
So we're starting our new series, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, where we will be discussing each MCU movie in order, all leading up to Marvel's Infinity War movie releasing next year in May. So today we are diving into the movie that started it all, Iron Man. How did this movie set up not only Phase 1, but the entire MCU? And why was it picked as the first launching point? How does the 10-year-old movie hold up? And where does it land in our ranking of Marvel movies? Find out the answer to these questions and much more on 'Cause We're Nerds, Road to Marvel's Infinity War. Wow. So, Iron Man will be 10 years old when Infinity War releases next year. Can you believe it, Caleb? It's quite a long time.
I know. It's been a long time. It's crazy because these movies have played such a large part in my life. And you know, the fact that they're only 10 years old just seems crazy to me.
So by the time Infinity War releases, they'll have 19 movies. That's about 2 every single year. That's insane.
Yeah, it's crazy. They've only taken 1 year off, which was 2009, I believe.
Yep.
Between Iron Man and Iron Man 2. But ever since, they've published or released at least one movie a year.
Do you remember anything about the announcement, the release, watching this Iron Man in movie theaters, or, I mean, when it came out 10 years ago? So that would have been 2008.
Yeah, so both of us were pretty young. So at the time, I was still in grade school when it was announced. I had no idea what this thing was. I never heard of it. The first exposure I had, I remember pretty vividly, was a trailer that some teachers at school were watching. And I walked up and was like, hey, what's going on? You know, what is this? And I saw it and I was like, wow, this looks really cool. And they were really big Marvel fans. And, you know, I grew up with the cartoons on TV and I was a big Spider-Man fan, but I didn't really read the comics. So Iron Man was a fairly new character to me.
Okay. I mean, and as we'll even find out in the movie itself, 10 years ago might not sound like a long time ago, but I mean, Facebook had just taken over MySpace at that time. So, I mean,
that's true. Yeah.
Iron Man himself makes a MySpace joke, which is like very now irrelevant, obviously.
Right.
But so like you couldn't just look it up on YouTube. That wasn't necessarily a thing back then. So I think you'd mostly catch it in, I don't know, going to the movie theater and watching trailers, which is where I think I saw the first trailer for Iron Man. I was pretty stoked. All I can remember, I guess, from the movie itself was just the excitement of Iron Man. Because I grew up reading, you know, Avengers comics, specifically Fantastic Four, just because that's what my dad collected. But, I mean, after reading Fantastic Four, I would read all the crossovers. So a lot of those were Avengers comics. So I loved Tony Stark, loved Iron Man, and I was pumped for this. I remember when it did come out in theaters, I saw it 3 times because, you know, once or twice. Yeah, that wasn't enough. It was a great movie.
Was that the first movie that you'd gone to multiple times?
Yeah, I believe so. I can't recall ever seeing a movie, for sure, not 3 times, maybe twice, but that movie, yeah. It was this old dingy theater. You know, before theaters had these recliners and heated seats and Coke machines that could put out 2,000 different Cokes or whatever, right?
Yeah. Back in the old days.
Back in the good old days. So, Caleb, before we jump into reviewing the movie itself, I thought we could spend some time talking about the build-up to the movie.
Sure.
So this was the first official MCU movie, correct? And I don't know what happened kind of behind the scenes to get this all started, because they tried to... I mean, there had been a couple superhero, specifically Marvel superhero movies in the past. You had the terrible CGI Hulk attacking tanks, some pretty horrendous Fantastic Four that never got released, and Captain America. But why don't you take us behind the scenes a little bit and how it all got started?
Sure. And, you know, the behind the scenes of this is actually really, really interesting. And quickly, before we go too far,
sure.
For those of you that don't know, we're specifically talking about the MCU, which stands for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And that's pretty much all the Marvel movies that Marvel itself has released, starting with Iron Man.
Yes.
So, you know, what's kind of interesting with this is the MCU kind of owes its existence to those 70s Superman movies. Did you know that?
I did not. No, I mean, I remember watching some of those movies. Obviously, not when they came out, but later on, and just, I mean, looking back, how corny they were. But I mean, they also were great movies.
Yeah. So, kind of the current, I guess, crop of Marvel movies started around 98 with the release of Blade, but the behind the scenes goes way back, like I said, to the 70s. That first Superman movie was directed by Richard Donner.
Okay.
However, his wife, Lauren, she is a producer in Hollywood. And Kevin Feige, who is now the person that heads up the MCU, actually worked as an intern under both Richard and Lauren. Because of that, he had the opportunity to actually become Lauren's assistant. Now, the other interesting thing is Lauren was one of the driving forces behind that very first X-Men movie.
The young ones, the X-Men we grew up, you had the young Hugh Jackman.
2000.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, that very first one. Because Kevin Feige was an assistant to her, he ended up getting promoted to an associate producer on that movie because of his knowledge of the Marvel Universe. And in fact, in a funny tidbit of information, he is the reason that Hugh Jackman's hair looks like Wolverine in that movie.
So it was Hugh Jackman come in with like a mullet, and Kevin Feige's like, that's not Wolverine, that's not happening? Or
Well, no, they were actually in the hair department, and I guess they were trying to figure out what his hair looked like, and Kevin Feige kept insisting that the stylist make it bigger and bigger so that it, looked like the comic books.
I could just, they're all talking in the room, and they're like, well, we don't really know what to do. And Kevin Feige like walks up, pulls a Wolverine comic from his pocket, be like, guys, hold on, check this out. Here's a 90s haircut.
Look, all right, we just need to tape this up on his face.
Yeah.
Pretty much. The hairstylist actually got fed up and ended up just, going as big as he wanted.
That's awesome.
There was another person there who was very impressed with this. And that guy's name is Avi Arad. Now, some people know this guy. He was involved in a lot of the early Marvel movies. And that's because, at the time, he was in charge of that division of Marvel. Because he was impressed, he ended up hiring Kevin Feige. So, he got hired because of his hair sensibilities.
Hey man, Kevin Feige, god of the MCU and hairstylist, apparently.
Right? So, Kevin started working under Avi for a few years. And at that time, and really going back to the 90s when Avi started working for Marvel, their goal was only to license superhero movies.
That's right. I mean, it would make sense. So they licensed Fantastic Four, and X-Men, Deadpool, everybody goes with that. What other licensing did they... Well, Spider-Man, obviously, to Sony.
At one point, they licensed pretty much everybody off.
Okay.
There was a group of maybe 10 characters, big ones, that they ended up getting the rights to later again. But they didn't have them for several years.
And solely for movie purposes, correct? So they still retain the rights for comics and toys and games and anything else not related to movies.
And the whole reason they started this to begin with is in the 90s, there was rampant speculation on comic books. People buying them up saying, this comic's going to be worth thousands of dollars later. And as you know, and a lot of people know, that caused the market to bust.
Yes.
In the late 90s. And a whole lot of stores closed, and comics were not valued very highly at all. So they were just trying to get any money they could out of these licenses. And a lot of them were not very good deals for Marvel. But what made them worth it is they got all merchandising rights. So while, Fox might make X-Men, any tie-ins or anything, Marvel has control of, and they get all the profits from that side of it.
Exactly.
So, jumping forward again, Kevin Feige's working under Avi at Marvel, and his job is to pretty much oversee these licensed movies that people are making. Read the scripts, give notes, make suggestions, that sort of thing. And it got to a point where he was frustrated because, you have these flops like, say, Elektra or Daredevil that were critically panned, were financially not successful. And in a lot of cases, he provided good feedback that would have made the movies better. Also around this time, Avi met with some other guys, and they had an idea. Hey, why don't we make our own movies instead of licensing these out? we can make more money, we can have more control, and it'll be better for the brand as a whole.
Exactly.
So he pulled some funding together with a couple of people, and Marvel took out some loans, putting up their characters as collateral if it didn't pay off.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty big step by Marvel.
I know. It's actually, financially, it wasn't a big risk because they would just lose some licensing to their characters. But if that would have happened, we would never have had the movies we have today because Marvel wouldn't own the licenses. So they got the money, and they ended up hiring 3 directors at that time. The first one was Jon Favreau. They hired to direct Iron Man. They hired Louis Leterrier. I know that's butchering that name.
Mr. Louis
Leterrier. Anyway, he was hired for The Incredible Hulk.
Yes.
And at the same time, they hired Edgar Wright to do Ant-Man. So things were going along smoothly. They were in pre-production. And Avi, he said in interviews that he's a one-man show. He likes to be in charge. He likes to kind of have final say. He doesn't really like to be part of a big machine. So he ended up leaving Marvel. That happened in May of 2006, I believe. And there's kind of conflicting reports about where they were in production at this stage. But I believe that's right as production and filming was starting on the first Iron Man movie.
Okay.
And the next year, Kevin Feige was hired into the role that Avi had as president of production over Marvel Studios. And that's how that whole structure got started for them to be able to do this in the first place. Slowly
climbing the ranks, Mr. Feige himself.
Yeah. He never would have gotten it if it wasn't for Lauren
the hairstylist,
Donner. Yeah, and the hair.
The hair.
And another interesting thing is, at this time, Marvel had ideas of what they wanted to do, but they didn't know exactly. In fact, they went to their first Comic-Con, Marvel Studios did, in 2006, and announced plans to make their own movies. And at the time, they announced that the villain for the first Iron Man movie would be the Mandarin.
Which, it got a ton of applause, I'm sure, at Comic-Con, but when they sat back down, they're like, all right, that was a good stunt. What's a real villain?
Right. Yeah, but, that didn't end up happening.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show that at this point, they're in untreaded waters. They don't really know what they want to do yet. They don't know exactly how to do it, really, because there's people that are stepping into roles they've never had to fill before.
Yeah. See, now it brings up an interesting point when we eventually dive into the Iron Man movie, which is they went ahead and cast Robert Downey Jr., knowing, okay, this is one movie, but I'm assuming they had a vision for this potentially becoming larger than just one movie. And so you could say they almost took a risk on Robert Downey Jr., because at this point, his acting career, he had gotten into some drugs, some alcohol, the actor himself. He'd kind of gone down that spiral. And then he had a few roles here or there, but nothing this prominent at all.
Yeah, you're right. Hiring him was a pretty big risk on their part. And going along with that, it was actually a pretty big risk to do this at all, because at this point, kind of like how comics died down in the 90s, comic book movies had started to die at this point. You had big franchises like Spider-Man, and Spider-Man 3 was a critical flop. It made a lot of money, but it...
Wait, are you saying you did not like emo Peter Parker dancing in the streets, whipping his hair?
No opinions on Spider-Man 3.
Hip thrusting, the hip thrusting Peter Parker. That's my favorite. I mean, like when I go into the comic book store, I look the guys right in the eyes and say, "Give me the hip thrusting Peter Parker. I want the emo hair, man. Emo hair."
Yeah.
No, but that's a good point. I mean, DC at this point was killing it, though.
Yeah, DC. Right. Before Iron Man, they had released Batman Begins. The Dark Knight came out the same year as Iron Man, so it wasn't really known what that was going to be yet. But, between Spider-Man, there were a lot of other flops that just did not do well. You had things, like I mentioned earlier, Elektra and Daredevil, which just really kind of brought down the entire franchise of comic book movies. And so the fact that they were going to try to launch their own in the midst of all of this is really astounding.
Yeah, that is pretty astounding that they would take the risk. But, I mean, hindsight, it definitely paid off. So So obviously, on our next podcast, we'll be talking about what happened with the Incredible Hulk, and then later on, it'll be 12, 13 podcasts ahead of us. We'll get into the nitty-gritty details of Ant-Man and everything that happened behind those scenes. But as far as Iron Man goes, with Kevin Feige stepping to the helm, production went fine. It wrapped up and was produced, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it all went smoothly-ish. It got released, obviously, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but, obviously did well. But production on this movie was actually kind of a mess. There's been a lot of interviews with Jeff Bridges, who plays Obadiah Stane in the movie, talking about how they really didn't have a completed script when filming started.
Wow.
Yeah, and, there's other movies that have done the same thing, and they normally turn out terribly. But there were things that they were making up on the day, like big plot details that they were making up on the day. They were coming up with, all the dialogue on the day. A lot of this movie is improvised, and you can tell that with Robert Downey Jr. and the things that he does.
Yep.
But it's actually amazing that, given how little of this movie was planned out to the T, how well it came out.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into it when we review the movie, but commercially, I mean, it was a success, which is amazing. And obviously lit some flame under that fire and pointing them in the direction, which, I mean, it brings up the question, with Kevin Feige at the helm, with these 3 movies kind of going in to launch the MCU, did Kevin Feige, did Marvel have a vision for an extended universe as vast as 19 movies in 10 years?
No. Or
were they just throwing out these movies hoping they could get some revenue and then seeing where it takes them?
It was kind of more of the second one. They had hopes. Everybody has hopes when they start something, but they didn't really have any sort of long-term plan. It wasn't until they saw the success of the first Iron Man movie and some things that happen in it that they were able to say, you know what, this is viable to do for a long time, and we can start weaving things together.
And they did. Well, before we launch into the movie itself, I would go ahead and read a little synopsis. A billionaire, industrialist, and ingenious inventor, Tony Stark, is conducting weapon testing overseas, but terrorists kidnap him to force him to build a devastating weapon. Instead, he builds an armored suit and upends his captors. Returning to America, Stark refines the suit and uses it to combat crime and terrorism and pepper pots. But we will get into that. All right, so first off, first impressions after watching this movie again.
So I remember, I've seen this movie several times.
Yeah.
And I actually watched it with my wife, who hadn't seen it in a long time. It was actually a really good counterexample to my reactions, because I know most of the beats in this film. I can quote lines from it, but because she hadn't seen it in so long, there were a lot of things she didn't remember.
Sure.
One of those was, the opening of the movie. She did not remember that it started in the desert. I remembered that it started in the desert. What I didn't remember is how gritty this opening is.
Yeah. No, you bring up a good point. I mean, I watched it with my wife as well, and this is, Iron Man's one of the characters she'll actually watch. She loves all the Marvel movies, but she loves Iron Man the best. And we were watching it, and I just couldn't believe, from the movies we get later on, this just seems a lot more grittier. I mean, I think a lot more edgier. So, I mean, they had a nonchalant sex scene. They had a lot of violence. They kind of had Iron Man just offing people. Where later on, you wouldn't really see that in Ant-Man as much, right?
Right. I agree. And, one of the things that I really came away thinking, wow, is they have an entire movie that's about a war, Captain America. And this opening is probably the most gritty and, I've never been in a war, but realistic to my imagination depiction of what war is like.
Exactly.
And I don't think we really see that again after this movie.
No, I think that's a good point. But it's interesting to bring up that when this movie came out, I thought this was a phenomenal change that either Favreau or Feige or whoever decided on the script went with, and I thought this worked really well, is switching it from his origins. So if you're not familiar with it, the origins of Iron Man are fairly similar, except that he is in the Vietnam during the Vietnam War and gets captured by the Viet Cong. And he sets off a booby trap, and basically the same thing happens, gets shrapnel into his system. And I can't remember the doctor's name. They changed his name, I believe, in this movie to Yinsen. Helps him escape, dies in the process, but then he gets a suit of armor. So, I mean, it's basically, It's the same. The first, I guess, act of this movie is the same as the comic origin, but they just changed the setting from the Vietnam War to the Afghan War, war in Iraq. Yes. And I thought it fit perfectly. Now, obviously, back in 2008, it wasn't as prominent as it was. I would say it was more, I mean, it wasn't winding down, but it wasn't as prominent. But I thought it still worked really well.
I agree. And I actually thought that, looking back on it, it feels more prominent now to that time than it did for me at the time. And part of that is probably because I was, so much younger than I am now, and I have some of that distance to look at it that way.
I think this brings up a good example on what I guess the MCU does with now all their heroes, is that they don't stick them, unless a few examples, they don't, keep them in a certain time in the comic time frame, kind of this old school setting. Instead, they modernize all their heroes, which I think works extremely well and works to their advantage.
I agree. And one of the things you'll see throughout this entire series is probably what makes Marvel so successful, is they're able to take these characters and modernize them, as you said, but also make sure that the characters are true to their comic book counterparts, and that they never do anything that their comic book counterparts would not do.
Exactly. I know another impression I had walking away from this was Robert Downey Jr. looks incredibly young. I mean, obviously it's been 10 years, but compared to, when we saw him in Captain America Civil War, which is the last time we've seen him, he is young.
My memory of this movie was that he looks so incredibly young. And coming back to it this time, I didn't feel that he looked as young as my memory said he did. And maybe that's because I haven't seen Iron Man 2 in a while, but I remember there being quite a bit of aging between Iron Man 1 and Iron Man 2, even though they're just 2 years apart.
Yep. No, I think this movie ages fairly well. So as we just talked about, the setting works really well. There's obviously some jokes that don't necessarily hit at the beginning. I already mentioned this. He's taking a picture with one of the soldiers in the Humvee, right? And he's like, I don't want to see this on your MySpace page. And it's like, well, that's not relevant anymore.
Not so much a thing. But he's talking so fast that I think it's easy to ignore it.
Exactly. So looking at this movie, I guess, as a whole, what would you say are positive moments in the movie? So moments or arcs or characters that just work really well besides the setting that it was placed in.
I think that his relationship with Yinsen at the beginning of the movie is really, really well executed. And he's not in there a lot, time-wise, but you really feel that they form this bond. And I think that makes his sacrifice later really mean something.
It does. And spoiler alert, this character actually comes back in Iron Man 3, which we will talk about.
Oh, that's true. I forgot about that.
He does. He makes a short appearance. But I agree with you. I think that was a really good character development between both of them.
And overall, this movie is a long movie. It's over 2 hours long, but it feels very brisk. Even after having seen it so many times, I really wasn't looking at my watch to see how much time was left, which is a testament to how entertaining and how tight of a movie this is. Pretty much everything that happens is there for a reason. There's no loose scenes. There's nothing that's there just to fill up time. It's really well made.
Exactly. It's a movie made for itself. It's, as we talked about, they didn't necessarily know they were going to do more movies after this, and you can definitely tell that in the movie itself. I mean, Act 1 is his whole origin, his whole, comic book origin, and it's wrapped up by Act 1, and they still have Act 2 and 3 to go, but they don't waste that time meandering about. They actually develop the characters, develop the plot forward, and Act 3 really feels like a great finale.
It really does. And another thing that was interesting is that back when this movie came out, the technology that they were showing was revolutionary. I remember everybody thought the technology in this movie was so cool, especially his interactive holograms.
Yep.
But coming back to it now, with 10 years distance, we still don't have these things in everyday life. But it's less novelty. It's like, oh, cool, there's, Tony Stark doing his thing. And I think part of that is a symptom of having seen him in so many movies since then.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's been in 3 Iron Man movies. He's been in 2 Avengers movies. He was in the Spider-Man movie. So that's at least 6 movies he's appeared in as a prominent character. And I think some of the wonder of Tony Stark gets lost as we go along that path.
Sure.
But even in this first movie, I think that it's really still well done. And that's impressive, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Because later movies, sometimes you turn on Tony as a character. But this first movie, he's really, you want to root for him.
And I think that positive is that Robert Downey Jr. just did a phenomenal job. Acting-wise, character development-wise, just over the top. I think this was a great pick for a character, for Tony Stark. I also thought that the humor in the movie did extremely well. So they, it wasn't overly humorous, but they had a lot of humorous parts. And I think a lot of that is a testament to Robert Downey Jr. himself, just as his acting and playing to Tony Stark as a character.
Yes. And humor is something that kind of gets away from Marvel at some point in their history where it becomes a little too jokey. But in this movie, it's the perfect balance.
It really is. Another thing I would like to touch on too, in regards to, I guess, just moments in the movie and wanted to get your thoughts on it was, what did you think about this soundtrack? So what I thought was interesting about Iron Man is that I remember when they were marketing for the movie, it was heavily pushed that they had a great soundtrack. It obviously being AC/DC, specifically their song, Iron Man, right? And so they marketed it, Iron Man, he's metal and obviously not metal, metal armor, and this is a metal band. They have a song about Iron Man, an Iron Man. And so it was heavily marketed with this designated soundtrack, which I don't think we've seen since until Thor Ragnarok, which heavily marketed the Immigrant song, which again, I thought worked really well for Thor, this previous Thor. But what did you think? Do you think it tied in really well for the movie? I think it worked on a marketing standpoint, but from the movie, I'm not so sure about.
I remember being disappointed because, as I mentioned earlier, I didn't really know Iron Man, but I knew the Iron Man song that was very popular at the time. And in the trailers, I remember the moment where he's trying to break through the metal door. They cut all the music, and then as soon as he breaks through, that song starts playing. And so I was very excited going into this movie to see that moment. And when it wasn't in the movie, I was very, very disappointed. But you're right. They do use a lot of that type of music in this movie. And I think for this movie, it works. I think that it matches who Tony Stark is, the kind of music that he would probably listen to. And I don't think that it's too overbearing.
I would definitely agree. I think they could have utilized maybe that soundtrack a little more. But overall, it worked as a marketing stunt. And so it worked for the movie. What did you think of Hugh Hefner?
Mr. Stan Lee. As we were watching it, my wife turned to me and said, "Are you guys going to talk about Stan Lee's cameos every time?" It's so funny because at this point, he's done cameos. He had done cameos in several other movies, and so it was already a thing. And the fact that he's gotten to continue it in all of the MCU movies is just great. And I think his cameo here is wonderful. You see him from behind. You don't know who it is. Tony Stark mistakes him for Hugh Hefner, and he turns around, and who is it? Stan Lee.
Stan Lee himself. Now, unfortunately, Stan Lee, I don't think he looked any younger than he did in Thor. So, but
I don't think Stan has changed the way he's looked since the 90s.
I think he's been around, and he'll continue to be around until, well, hopefully for the future, a long time in the future.
Yeah.
So what do you think about S.H.I.E.L.D. and how they played out? Watching the movie again, I did not remember that S.H.I.E.L.D. played such a major role as they did. I mean, they obviously didn't play, a substantial role, but their role was fairly major in the third act with Pepper Potts escaping Obadiah and
Yes.
gaining their help.
And I had kind of forgotten about Coulson as a character in this movie, which is sad because I used to love his character.
Mm-hmm. Do you think S.H.I.E.L.D. kind of ruined that for you?
Something happens to Coulson later on, and he ends up in his own TV show called Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., which is currently airing on ABC right now. And I do think that kind of ruined Coulson a little bit as a character because he is in all of the Phase 1 movies,
yes,
which is Iron Man through the Avengers, but we only get small bits of him. But the small bits we get are so good. And then he gets his own TV show, and, you know, he's in that week to week, the whole thing.
Yeah.
And it's good because you see a different side of him, but it loses some of the magic of that character. But seeing him in this, he is so different than how he is in the show. And part of that's through necessity, you know. In this, he's kind of sheepish.
Yep.
But in his show, he's more of a commanding presence. But for this movie in particular, it works really well. I will say there is kind of a continuity break in this film that has to do with S.H.I.E.L.D., which is their name. In this movie, as you're going through, they keep talking about the Strategic Homeland Intervention Enforcement and Logistics Division.
Correct.
And, you know, it's a running joke that you guys really should come up with a better name for that.
Yep.
Yeah, at the end they say, oh, just call it S.H.I.E.L.D. Well, the problem with that is in later movies, they've retconned this, and they're calling it S.H.I.E.L.D. back in the 70s and 80s.
Yes.
So I don't really know how that fits. It's kind of a dumb thing to complain about.
But it's an easier retcon than any of the X-Men movies.
Oh, let's not get into that.
If you want the podcast to continue on for the next 8 hours, we can hash that out. But
we'll untangle the timeline.
That's right. What'd you think of I don't know if you caught this, but there are a couple little name drops, little hints, little secrets in the movie. I didn't catch it watching it in the movie theaters for those 3 times, but rewatching it, you know, I caught some of these. For example, the planes that are chasing Iron Man are named Whiplash 1 and Whiplash 2.
You're right. I didn't even notice that.
Yep. Do you think that was an intentional tie-in for a potential enemy in the Iron Man 2?
I don't think they were thinking, oh, let's give a shout out to the villain for the next movie, but I do think that they did it as an Easter egg.
And what's interesting is, so in Act 3, Obadiah becomes Ironmonger, goes after Tony, etc. However, he never names himself. However, he does call himself, as well as Tony, the Ironmongers. And I believe it's there in the arc reactor room. He says, "We are the Ironmongers, we sell weapons." So I thought it was kind of an interesting name drop for the villain. A little foreshadowing.
And that kind of started a trend that's in several of these Marvel movies, which is throwing in a pun or, the name of the villain without specifically calling them that villain. They did it here. They do it with the Abomination and the Incredible Hulk. They do it to a lesser extent as the movies go on, but Baron Zemo, I don't know if they ever call him Baron in that movie.
No.
I don't think that's a bad way to go, because I think if you come out and you say, "Oh, Tony Stark, I'm Ironmonger," that kind of loses some of that realism.
It really does.
That you've built up. So I think it was a nice nod to his comic book origins.
Okay, so a lot of positives, a lot of interesting little tidbits to this movie. Let's talk about the dark side of the moon. What were some of the negative moments that just you watched it and you're like, that worked when I was young and now this just doesn't work, or man, this is just awful?
Well, the one thing that stood out to me that I noticed this time, and it might just be because I know how they did it, is the scene where Tony comes back from the cave and he's trying to put in the new arc reactor and he calls Pepper down to help him.
Yep.
When I saw it the first time, I was like, wow, how did they do that? She put her hand in his chest. That's crazy. Well, I've seen all the special features and stuff since then. I know that he's actually standing behind the chair and everything from his chest down is a prosthetic.
Yes.
It's fake.
Yep.
And seeing it this time, I felt that was a lot more obvious.
Okay.
Especially as they cut between that and the real him, because his real body is, it's thicker, it's more full than the thing that they put on the table. But that could just be because, like I said, I knew that that's how they did it.
Okay. So I did not know that's how they did it. I haven't watched the special features. So, I mean, you could definitely tell there was some illusion happening there, but for the most part, I thought it worked out well. And, Tony Stark has a nice body. He doesn't have a little SpongeBob block body that we see in Kylo Ren.
Yeah, he's been working out.
Yeah. He doesn't have a Kylo Ren body. Go see Star Wars Episode 8.
I think he kind of does, actually.
He doesn't have square pants, but it's pretty nice.
Yeah, other than that, there wasn't much in this movie that I thought looked bad or didn't work. Obviously, the special effects have aged a bit, but the moments that I noticed it were the same moments I noticed it before, but they're still not bad. They're just not seamless.
Sure.
And I think that's fine. Sometimes there's like a floating head. Like when he's come back from Gulmira and he's trying to take the suit off. I think that you've got a little bit of floating head syndrome there. But other than that, I didn't really have any issues. What about you?
I would agree with you for the most part. There were some issues. I thought that, okay, that doesn't necessarily seem unbelievable. For example, when he finally escapes the terrorists, the Ten Rings, right?
Yes.
And he's setting everything ablaze, and they get a mounted machine gun that it looks like it has armor-piercing ammo on it. And he's just staying alive, and then he flies up, maybe 100, 150 feet up into the air, lands to the sand dunes, completely fine. So there's a couple things that are like, watching it,
You're
again,
right.
I was like, but I don't think it took away from the movie at all. For me, I guess the one that was kind of like, all right, this is a little over the top, was how every villain seemed to have the Stormtrooper syndrome. So if you look, the leader of the Ten Rings, right, he gets his RPG locked up. Here comes Iron Man. And then Jensen's like, watch out. And he fires it. And he is 5 feet away from Iron Man. And he just completely misses. And so, like, Tony Stark turns, he gets his really cool, he has one rocket on his suit of armor. And he lights it kind of like a firework, which I thought was a really cool effect. And then he fires it at the guy and completely misses him. And they're like 5 feet away. Like, imagine you're 5 feet away from somebody and you can't like hit him with a rock. So that was like, And then the other one I thought was a little laughable was when the climax, right? So Tony Stark's on the ceiling. He's just hanging on. He's staying there. And Obadiah is trying to shoot him. And he has just a plethora of missiles. And he fires one after the other. And they are just going, like, he cannot hit the broadside of a barn. He's not even close. And how they get around that is he states, my targeting computer is malfunctioning. Stand still. And, like, Iron Man's just hanging there. He's not moving. Like, all right, Obadiah, you don't have to have a targeting system. Just line up your arm with his head and fire. Like, it's not that hard.
True. Although I think, to give them a little bit of stuff to work with here, I think they're both in ginormous suits when that's happening. And I don't know if you can really line up the arm with your eye.
True.
Because the shoulder can't move over. You see what I'm saying?
No. I completely see it. But the first two shots, like, just miss the building completely. And you're like, all right, maybe you need to go to an eye doctor. Maybe get a new mask. But I mean, in general, I think good movie, not a huge, we have some complaints, but they're nitpicking. In the general scheme of things, they're good. One last thing I did want to bring up on that point is, what did you think of Obadiah? Did this kind of start the downfall of villains? And I'm sure we'll talk more about this in future episodes, but the MCU isn't necessarily known as having the best villains with a great story arc. And I know a lot of that complaint is that the villains are simply recreations of the heroes, but evil. And that's what Obadiah is. He's a recreation of Tony Stark, but evil. Did this work? Do you think this set up that downfall of villains we see in the MCU, or what's your take on it?
Well, there's actually a couple things I want to talk about with Obadiah, but for this in particular, comic book movies at this time, I don't think had matured to a really good state where they know how to do them. Yeah, we'd had some good ones, like we'd had some good X-Men movies, we'd had some good Spider-Man movies, but they hadn't really figured out the formula. This was the first one that felt, I don't know, kind of not like it's just a superhero movie. It felt more like a movie with superheroes in it. And I think that they get a pass on Obadiah pretty much being the same villain because of that.
Sure.
The other reason I think they get a pass is it's an origin movie. They're telling an origin that takes an entire act of the movie away, which you would normally be developing a villain. You don't even find out that he's a villain until, the last act of the movie? And he doesn't have a lot of build-up. And yeah, you could see that as a flaw, or you could just see it as a product of the time and what they had to work with for the film.
Yep, I would agree. And So when you get to the end of the movie, now I remember this being a fairly controversial point. Last scene, right? He's on stage. There's announcers. There's the character of that one reporter that he was with, and then is kind of shows up, every scene or scene or two. That I don't know if her character arc necessarily works, but she's the one that's always after the truth. And does the well, how are we supposed to believe you? And Tony Stark kind of BS's it for some of it, and then at the end he states, well, the truth is, I'm Iron Man. If you're just watching the movie, I think that's fine. But knowing the comics that he hid his identity for a long time. He had the old suitcase Iron Man where he would store his whole suit in a suitcase. What was your reaction, not, watching it for the first time and then rewatching it with that scene?
Well, I remember seeing it for the first time and being really shocked because so many of the superhero movies that had come out before, they were all about that secret identity side of it. Mm-hmm. Looking back at it now, Marvel does not have very many heroes with a secret identity in their films. Spider-Man has a secret identity. But other than that, off the top of my head, I can't think of anyone else, maybe Ant-Man, that has an actual secret identity. And I remember Kevin Feige coming out and saying that they didn't want to play up that whole secret identity thing because at the time, you'd had so many movies that had done it before. Mm-hmm. They wanted something that was different. And by taking that out, it allows you to not have to write in plot contrivances or conveniences or excuses for the character to go do the things that you want them to do. So I think it was really bold at the time, and I think it continues to work. Now, I do wish that they would have some more heroes with a secret identity, because I do miss that side of, superheroes.
Yeah, who are they?
Right. And I think it can create a lot of interesting drama, but I think at the same time, he's right. If you do that for every character, it's just going to get very boring.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I remember watching it in theaters and being shocked, just completely stunned that he revealed it for the first time. And I think I walked out of there mad too. I'm like, they ruined the character of Iron Man. How could he reveal, even in the comics? In the comics at this point, identity was huge because in 2008, in the summer 2008, they were on their Secret War cycle, the crossover that involved all the comics. So, as a reader of those comics, you were trying to figure out the identities of everyone. Not only their superhero identity, which you knew, but I'm talking more about if you're unfamiliar with the Secret Wars storyline, is that there's an alien race, the Skrulls, that come in and start. They can shapeshift, so they start shapeshifting into different superheroes, and you find out that some heroes aren't the heroes you believe them to be. They were, they have been a alien for the last couple of years, and so it's the story arc really was whose truthful identity really matters, and the movie kind of throws that out. So I remember being angry. Watching it now, I thought it worked really well, especially going into setting up the rest of the Marvel movies, setting up Iron Man as a character, and just Kevin Feige's explanation in general.
Yeah, and I think you call that Secret Wars. That's actually the Secret Invasion storyline.
You're right. Yep.
And, it goes to say that at that point, the Marvel comics had been running since the 40s, 50s, 60s. And they've had a lot of time to build up, and they didn't really change the status quo that often. And when they did, it usually reverted back to the status quo within a couple of years. And so they're able to play with that secret identity idea without it having as many repercussions. There's been times in the comics where, for example, Spider-Man reveals his identity during the Civil War story arc.
Yep.
Later, they retconned it. Nobody knows who he is anymore.
No.
And that works in comics to an extent, but you can't really do that in a movie and it be believable.
Exactly.
The one other thing I did want to touch on with Obadiah is a common complaint is that
he's bald.
Tony Stark, right? Cue ball. Yeah. Tony Stark spends the first half of the movie figuring out how to work his suit. Mm-hmm. And Obadiah gets in it at the very end and is able to work it perfectly. What do you think about that?
Not counting the last scene where he can't hit the broadside of a barn.
Right.
I don't think that complaint's necessarily justified. I mean, if you watch the movie, and this is something I kind of noticed is he flies. I mean, he moves like the Hulkbuster armor, very clunky, very slow, very, getting used to everything. And, a lot of what he does is simply pick up cars, throw cars, punch, move. And even his flight is pretty, it's pretty slow. He just flies straight up. And his, I think, suit's built differently, where Iron Man's very agile and has to have a lot of control. His suit's built a lot like a rocket. I mean, if you see his, boots that I guess have the weaponry and the ability to fly, it's very slow, very methodical. And so I don't see that complaint, but I guess I could see where people might have it, but I don't agree with it.
Yeah, and I agree with you. He is built more like a tank. He is kind of clumsy with it. And I've had this conversation with other people. He flies literally straight up in the air. And most of the movie, Tony was trying to figure out how to fly. Mm-hmm. He wasn't dealing so much with the repulsors. He wasn't dealing so much with the other aspects of it. It was just the flight and how to move correctly. Well, the Ironmonger does not have repulsor stabilizers in his hands.
Nope.
So that automatically takes out a lot of the complexity. He's got the rocket boosters in his back and in his boots. The only evidence that kind of goes against our argument is there's a point where he runs up and jumps and does like this little boost with his rocket boots to punch Iron Man. And sometimes you have to have some suspension of disbelief, especially in comic book movies. But I think that, he's not great at piloting it. He's only okay, and like you said, he uses mostly physical attacks. So I think personally, it's completely fine. It's completely justified. But I was just curious, since that is such a big complaint.
Sure, and I think a lot of it that people are forgetting is that Iron Man has Jarvis. So I would assume that this system he built will also have an AI assisting him. And so maybe it's not him that, did the boot thrusts and some of the flying capabilities. Maybe it's simply the AI that is assisting him in that, and that is firing those systems.
Certainly a possibility.
Awesome. So Caleb, we talked about, the buildup of the movie, Kevin Feige going from a hairstylist to president in 2 seconds. We talked about that Iron Man, while having some negatives and some stuff we nitpick, is overall just a great movie. I think now it's time to talk about, what's the after effects of Iron Man. So starting off, how did the movie do, I guess, what was its budget? Did Marvel score a big hit with this? Was it a letdown? And then I guess, how does this set the stage for future MCU movies? But just in general, why don't you give us the stats on the movie?
So for Marvel itself, this movie was a major, major home run. And even by normal Hollywood standards, this movie did very well. So it had a budget of $140 million, which is, it's kind of high, but it's not ridiculously high at the time. And it had a worldwide gross of $585 million.
That's good. And reception on it, what critics score, Rotten Tomatoes, what does that look like?
Reception was very good. I mean, if you look at Rotten Tomatoes, which, everybody has their own feelings about Rotten Tomatoes. You don't just want to trust it.
No.
But it's currently sitting at a 94%. And most people you talk to, they'll say it was a great movie. And for a long time, this made Iron Man people's favorite superhero, even people that had no idea who he was before.
Exactly. Now, going into the discussion of Iron Man, you talked about how Marvel, and specifically Kevin Feige, didn't necessarily have a plan to set up the future stage for, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and the rest of the MCU. Did the success of Iron Man change that, or when did they start to form plans? Was it after this movie?
So Iron Man definitely influenced that. One of the big things is this movie has an after the credit scene.
Yes.
It's not the first movie to have one, like some people think, but it is the one that started the Marvel trend of after the credit scenes. And the way that came about was actually director Jon Favreau thought it would be fun, and I'm sure he talked with Kevin Feige and they kind of hashed it out. It would be fun to have Samuel Jackson come in as Nick Fury. And that's significant because in the Ultimate version of the comic books, Nick Fury is drawn to look like Samuel Jackson. So have him come in say he's Nick Fury, and say, you're part of a bigger world.
Mm-hmm.
You're not the only superhero. I want to talk to you about the Avengers Initiative. And to Jon Favreau, he thought, this would just be a fun thing for fans. Kevin Feige kind of thought the same thing. It was meant as an Easter egg. And that's why it was placed after the credits in the movie.
No one was supposed to necessarily see it. Yep.
Sure. It was only for hardcore fans because it doesn't really fit in the movie itself. So they didn't want it to distract. They didn't want it to ruin the flow. Word got around, and Kevin Feige said that very next Monday, there were tons and tons of articles online about who Nick Fury is and what this means. And between the success of the movie and the reaction to that scene in particular, that kind of set the course for what Marvel was going to do. That's what made Kevin say, oh, you know what? We can make more movies, and we can make them interconnected, just like the comic books. And, we'll see next week, there's another scene in The Incredible Hulk, and the only reason that's there is because of this after the credits scene. They shot that scene for The Incredible Hulk after this movie came out, and there's only about 2 months between the two movies.
So it really goes to show you that because of the success of Iron Man, I mean, this was a launching point for the rest of the MCU. If Iron Man had flopped, had failed, had been a disaster, we probably wouldn't have these 19 movies and counting.
That's true. And, they did have The Incredible Hulk that same year. It came out actually a month later.
It did, yep.
But it was a modest success. Mm-hmm. If Iron Man had failed completely and The Incredible Hulk was a major success, we might be looking at a 19-movie empire, but it would probably be a very different movie experience. But if both of them had failed, we would definitely not be sitting here today. It is all thanks to Iron Man and Jon Favreau and Kevin Feige and the whole cast and crew that any of this happened at all. It's kind of an amazing accident.
And as we'll be talking about in future podcasts too, is that Robert Downey Jr. with his acting as well really sets the stage of having Tony Stark as being the center figure, the centerpiece of the MCU. Now you could argue that, Captain America could potentially be that centerpiece, but as we'll get into it, I personally believe, and I believe Caleb shares the same sentiment, is that Iron Man truly is the centerpiece of the entire MCU. So, which will be interesting going into Iron Man 2, 3, and all the Avengers movies.
I agree. And, that does start to shift maybe a little bit later. But from here on through definitely the Avengers, probably all the way up until Avengers 2, Age of Ultron, he is the centerpiece, and he is the most popular character. He's the one that they market the most, because he brings in the most money. And it all makes sense because he started with such a good movie. Why wouldn't you do that?
Now, something that we'll definitely get into an Iron Man 2 is the fact that we have a different sidekick for Iron Man, specifically the actor from Terrence Howard. Do you think Terrence Howard's acting in this movie was good, was bad, was phenomenal?
I'm kind of indifferent about him. I think he does a fine job. I don't think he did anything poorly. I don't think he did anything great either. I think he's just serviceable in the role. And
you know what? I would agree. And obviously the reason I bring that up is that they hint at him for the next movie, is that while this is a self-contained movie, they do have a lot of setups for a potential next movie. Next time, baby.
Yeah, I know. And I know that got a lot of people excited. And it had a lot of people wondering, will we get War Machine in the next movie? Which is what that scene was hinting at. In the comic books, James Rhodes suits up in an Iron Man suit of armor called War Machine, and it's gray or silver. And I think that was a really great tease. I think that that's something they learned from the Spider-Man series, the Sam Raimi series, is how to make nods to other things that could happen or other characters without it taking away from the movie.
So instead of making him an emo, hip-thrusting, second Iron Man, they're like, hey, we can just do something simple. We don't have to jump the shark
no
with that.
Dancing here.
Yeah, no dancing. Caleb, one of the last things I wanted to touch on was specifically, how did this impact the comic books? So with the success of Iron Man, both domestic and international, and with just how Robert Downey Jr. portrayed that character. Did you see that this, changed his development in the comics, or specifically even a team development in the comics, or did they pretty much keep it the same?
So this actually changed his comic book persona, I think, a lot. Before this movie, Tony Stark was not the character you see in the movie. Yeah, he was kind of jokey, and yeah, he drank a lot and slept around, but he was more of kind of a stoic, serious character. Mm-hmm. He was not the level of jokiness that Tony is in this movie. He's not the Spider-Man level of jokiness. He's almost more like Captain America in his level of seriousness and how he handles things and holds himself.
It's kind of like your Pop. He's like a nice Pop figure. Well, nice dad.
Yeah. And at some point after this film came out, I can't say exactly when, is they kind of shifted his character in the comics to be more like the movie version, mm-hmm. which I think was inspired more by his Ultimate Comics version, mm-hmm. where he is a bit more jokey and kind of young and flippant about things. And that's a trend that you'll see them take kind of actually all through 2000 through like 2012 after the Avengers came out, is they start to shift comics to be more like the movies. Yep. But as that goes along, they do that less and less. And I think they learn a lesson that just because the movie's successful doesn't mean the comic books have to be the same. So long as the character is recognizable, that's all that matters. If everything's the same, then there's no reason to have two different versions, a movie version and a comic book version.
Exactly. And we'll touch on this in later podcasts, is that I truly believe the MCU has saved a lot of just Marvel as an industry in and of itself, because in the last 10 years, what you see is that specifically their comic sales have drastically started decreasing. However, on this side of things, they're making tons and tons of money with the movies they are releasing and how well each of them are doing.
Yeah, and we probably need to mention that before this movie came out, nobody except for comic book fans knew who Iron Man was.
No, Spider-Man, Wolverine,
Superman,
Batman,
maybe Wonder Woman.
But that's about it.
That's who the main populace knew. And bringing a B-list character like Iron Man mm-hmm. into the forefront and making him one of the world's most popular superheroes is amazing.
It's not a small feat.
It's not a small feat. And it's something that they have continued to do through the years, which, we'll touch on as we go through. But that's also part of what makes Marvel so successful. They can take any character they want and make an entertaining movie with him.
That's right. Help establish the MCU and the Marvel Empire.
That's right.
So wrapping up this discussion of Iron Man and just this, as we've talked about how it was a kind of shot in the dark and huge success for Marvel and their future endeavors. Each podcast, I thought we would fit each MCU movie in a personal ranking that we'd each have. And each movie that we do review, we would just continue to add to that ranking. So obviously we have one movie, so there is no ranking for this podcast. But just gauging in the future, where would you, I guess without knowing, predict where this movie might end up on your personal rankings? Do you think it's going to wind up in somewhere in the top 10, top 5, mid-pack, or near the bottom?
Without spoiling anything, I think that Iron Man as a standalone film is one of the better ones in Marvel's library.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think Iron Man in the MCU, when you look at all the movies, is definitely going to end up near the top. But you're going to have to listen to the rest of these to find out find it out. Find it all out. Keep that in. We're going to find them all out. Got to catch them all. Got to catch them MCU movie. Well, Caleb, any final thoughts on Iron Man or Kevin Feige's hair or Pepper Potts or...
I just want to give a quick shout out to Marvel and the people that work there, just to say thank you for everything that you guys are doing. I know that it's a business and you're there to make money, but you also care about what you're doing, and you guys are doing a great job. And I just want to give them a shout out, especially Kevin Feige, who is steering the entire ship.
That's right. He's doing a good job keeping those comics in his back pocket, whipping them out for Wolverine hairstyles whenever he can.
Well, before we go, I do want to say thank you to Taylor Poole for our intro music. He's phenomenal, and you can find him at taylorpoolemusic.com. That's TaylorPoole music.com.
Thanks for listening. You can find us on iTunes and any other major podcasting networks. Feel free to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram at Cuz We're Nerds. That's CUZWERENERDS. And tune in next week as we discuss The Incredible Hulk. Did a solo Hulk movie actually work? Why did this movie omit giant dogs and CGI tanks? Was Edward Norton the right choice for Bruce Banner? And does this movie indicate that Bruce Banner can never have sex? Find these answers and more on Cuz We're Nerds, Road to Marvel's Infinity War. Stay nerdy, folks.